Ladies and gents, my name is Matt Locke and you're listening to, and perhaps watching, the Unleashing Potential podcast. It's in these episodes that I chat with a range of progressive individuals who are unleashing their potential on the world around them at work and in life. With that said, I'm glad you're here so you can join me as we take a deep dive with today's guest. Neil, welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here. I'd love if you
nice to be here.
Yeah, thank you. It'd be great if you could just, let's kick off with you explaining just a little bit about who you are, where you are in the world, and we'll dive in from there.
So I'm here in London. I run a little business called The Conscious Professional. And I've got a journey which took me from being a Reiki master to being a barrister, which is a trial lawyer, to running my own training and coaching firm, which is all centered around mindfulness and conscious leadership.
Awesome. Now I know when we had a pre-chat, and as is always the way, I don't tend to ask too many questions so that it's nice and fresh and genuinely organic when we go live like we are now. I am itching to know how the journey of becoming a barrister took a turn to not being a barrister anymore and taking a very different career path. But actually, what I'm interested in, as the first question, I suppose, is to understand what it was that motivated you to put the huge amount of effort into becoming a barrister in the first place, only to find that actually it wasn't going to be your future.
Yeah, great question. I think we make these decisions very young, and realistically the reason that I started heading towards the legal profession as a child was because I love stationery, and it seemed like the lawyers had the best stationery. Like, I collected stationery when I was a kid. My mum used to work at conferences as a hostess, and she would bring back all these kind of free pads and pens and all sorts of kind of freebies from these companies. And I had a drawer that was just like stacked full of stationery. And that probably led my thinking a bit. I suppose I was reasonably good at like English and history and the sorts of things where the adults around you start saying, "Have you thought about law?" I was like, okay, did some work experience, and and then it got a bit more interesting when I started realizing there was two routes, same as in Australia, as I understand it. You can be a solicitor, more of a kind of office-based lawyer, or the barrister, trial-based lawyer. Because I was also sort of developing an interest in performance, the barrister thing seemed like a sort of safer way of heading towards something a bit more in the acting sort of public speaking realm, than going full on as an actor, which, I was quite shy growing up. So it took me a while to sort of get into acting, which I did mainly in uni.
Legal theatre, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's a lot of big personalities stomping around a courtroom, trying to sound eloquent and persuade people of stuff. So.
And often they do sound eloquent. And I, in a former life, I was a police officer in the UK, so I was on the, well, it depends, I guess, but yeah, I was certainly looking from a different angle, let's say, on the receiving end of those eloquent questions.
Yes, yeah, I've cross-examined a lot of police officers in my time.
Well, I hope you weren't too hard on, but anyway. Well, I have to say, I didn't expect that answer. It's the rationale of why or how you became a barrister or went down the legal path. But perhaps it's interesting though when we think about the motivation, the intrinsic motivation that took you off down that path. It wasn't a deep-seated sense of righting wrong or anything like that. It's interesting, actually, the trigger perhaps was an innocent question or regularly mentioned, oh, you thought about being a lawyer, you got all these pads and pens and so on. It's interesting how that might have been just the trigger at the time without realizing it by either party.
Yeah. And I suppose, there was a bit of the kind of idea of justice and righting wrongs, which, was appealing. And so as I learned more about it and started to kind of understand a bit about what lawyers did, what kind of, I suppose, kept drawing me on from the initial inspiration based in paper was the idea of helping people solve problems. I was always quite sort of fascinated by problem solving and felt like that was something that I wanted to be really kind of practical in the world. So it was a bit of a disappointment when I got to law school at Bristol University to realize that it was the academic study of law for 3 years. So it was like completely not practical at all. It was all about, learning these old cases. And, looking back, one understands this is an important grounding in how to, become a good lawyer, sort of well-rounded lawyer, and to think about things from lots of different angles and see where it comes from. But it took a while before the practical stuff kicked in.
Sure. And so you were practicing as a barrister. How many years did you do that before finally taking the step to follow a different career path?
Yeah, so I trained for 5 and I practiced for 7 or 8. So, yeah.
From what age? So I guess that was, through university.
Yeah, so probably about 18 to 22, 23, studying, and then practiced till I think I must have been 30 when I left.
It's it was a huge move. Did it feel like a huge move at the time, a shift to step away from all of that you'd known and to I guess, and the income that it provided to pursue a different path? So
it's a sort of a yes and no type of an answer to that one, because whilst I had been, studying law, going through, the early stages of my career, I'd also been growing my interest in Reiki and meditation, which had actually crossed my path before I became before I studied law. So I started learning Reiki when I was, by chance, really, in my late teens, so around 18.
Okay.
I was out in the States and working at a kids camp, and there was an Australian Reiki master from Melbourne who was the nature counselor. And he ended up teaching me and a few others Reiki across the summer. And it kind of completely blew my mind open to the energy kind of world, I suppose.
And so for those not familiar, could you just give us what's Reiki, just for those who are not familiar with it?
Yeah, so Reiki is a energy healing system. It's a hands-on or hands-off system. A lot of people might have come across it at a spa or on a retreat. There's often a Reiki practitioner there. The idea of it is it's about channeling universal source energy for the benefit of your client. And a lot of people experience it as relaxing. They might experience kind of pleasant physical sensations through the body. They might see different visual kind of effects or images. And some Reiki practitioners will work specifically with particular ailments and so on. And, it's another way of looking at health, another kind of angle into it.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Appreciate it. So 18 to 20-ish, you were becoming much more involved in that?
Yeah. So as I was going through uni in the summers, I was spending my summers out in the States. And there was that 1 year where I learned it, the sort of first beginning bit. The next year, I learned again with a different person, but who was also a fellow student the first year. And then the next year I went out to Kiribati in the Pacific, where my original Reiki master was now on mission. And I spent the summer there learning the master levels of Reiki and a type of Reiki. So my main practice is Usui Reiki, and then I learned another practice, which is Karuna Reiki, which brings in toning and sound. So it sort of became a real fascination. And by the time I was practicing as a barrister, I also had a little side business called the Holistic Life Practice. So that's what I mean by saying, it wasn't the biggest of surprises that there was something else coming. Having said that, I had this little business going on. It wasn't producing anywhere near the income of my legal practice.
Not many jobs do.
or kind of promising to, even if I sort of gave things up, it wasn't like, oh, here's the replacement mortgage.
Sure. Yeah.
But the actual kind of the final impetus to step away came about 8 years in, and I was just walking through the car park of in a temple in London. So it's sort of crazy area in town, which looks like it's sort of from the olden days, and there's these beautiful old traditional buildings and squares and churches and gardens, and it's lovely to walk through there. I was walking through the car park after trial. A friend of mine bounded up to me who I hadn't seen for ages. And said, "Hey Neil, how's it going? I hear you're one of the rising stars of the civil bar." Now, as he said those words to me, what I heard in my head was, "Your star is rising in the wrong field. You have to leave." So that was like the insight that landed, and it was delivered with such a vibration of truth. It was like a gong going off inside my body, and it was like, okay, this is now happening. And so it was sort of that moment that catalyzed all of the what if questioning into action in that moment. So it still took me 5 months to wrap it all up. But
you were clearly primed. You were ready, and it just needed that event.
Yeah, I didn't know I was ready, but yeah, looking back, I must have been ready because I said yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you listened.
Did you have a similar moment when you were heading out of the police or heading out of the country?
Oh, well, the police was a long time ago. I actually was a conversation with my father. I mean, I went from at 16, I was in the police cadets, and then at 18, I was wearing a big hat, walking around the streets of Birmingham. And I did, I think, 5 years of that. So seven very formative years of my sort of young life. And yeah, it was actually a conversation with my father who sat me down, and there were two parts to the conversation. The first was, we love you, but we don't like the person you're becoming. You're becoming very hard and cynical at such a young age. And the other thing was he was a dental surgeon, and I had myself and my brothers had a lovely upbringing, very privileged upbringing in many ways, and which we were aware of. And he just said, "Look, you've had a great upbringing. It's entirely up to you what you do for a career, and we'll support you in anything you do, but you just have to understand that the salary, the earning potential you have in the police isn't going to fund anything like the lifestyle that you've enjoyed." And it was the first part of that really struck the chord, I have to say. It was like, to be told by your dad that we love you, but we don't really like the person you're becoming, that really hit home. So that was actually the trigger for me. I had until that moment considered, I enjoyed the police. And had a good, had some really solid friendships, some which I still enjoy today. And it was all very exciting and so on for a young man in the UK. But that conversation was the turning point. And within 6 months, I had taken, at the time, they offered you a career break where you could take up to 5 years off, knowing that you could return to the job. And I knew I wouldn't return, but it was nice having that little safety net, I suppose. And that gave me the impetus to head overseas. I went to Canada and what was going to be just a bit of travel around Canada. We got some friends in Canada, family friends, and I was going to just bounce into there and then out again, and off I'd go. And I actually ended up staying and working for them and formed, a very new career path, which took me back to the UK and ultimately here to here in Australia and Singapore and everywhere else. I've been a bit of a gypsy. But it was interesting that there was a very clear moment for me, but it was a conversation with someone else I think the difference was I hadn't considered a career change. I hadn't considered not being a police officer. That was all I knew in my adult life, actually. But I was open to it, clearly.
Yeah.
It was shock tactics, maybe. But I listened, and I ultimately took action quite quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. So I suppose we both sort of recognized a truth in the message that came, and that spurred the action.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm interested, the conscious professional. How did that come to be then? Because it was a different company. You had the sort of side business when you were a barrister. You had the side business. And did that morph into the conscious professional, or was this something new?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it morphed in. It was a new entity, if I can put it that way. I left. The holistic life practice was already running, so I kept doing that. It wasn't enough to sort of keep everything sort of going. So I started doing some freelance training work here and there as well. But it was about 3 years into that. Well, my teacher calls it my walkabout phase. Sort of
That'll make sense to a lot of the audience here.
Yeah, so the 3-year walkabout phase. In a meditation, the name, logo, and the subject, mindfulness, landed all at once, and just it wasn't there, and then there it was. And that's quite a difficult process to sort of understand, really, or kind of explain. So it's best not to think about it too much, but just to say thank you and off we go. But it was from there, really, that everything sort of started moving in a clear direction. It was very much a corporate facing entity. And it was all about mindfulness, and this is in 2012. So in the UK, mindfulness had not landed as a mainstream thing.
So that would have been a tough sell, I think, back in 2012.
It was a non-sell.
I was being gentle.
Yeah, it was very much non-sell. So I went to the network that I had in the sort of training and learning development people, and it's like, oh, this is what I'm going to be doing. And they're like, we don't want it. We like you, but we don't want that. No, thank you. We don't know what it is. We definitely don't want it. Thanks for coming in. Like, this is great. So I started selling them professional resilience courses and adding in a module on mindfulness. And then they were like, oh, we like this mindfulness stuff. This is a few years later, but mind. It gradually built out from there.
Interesting though, isn't it? The language though, completely open to the resilience training.
Yeah.
Perhaps without understanding what the training actually entailed and why, but just the language was more acceptable then.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the resilience course, that's actually remained our most popular course, and it's sort of grown and grown because it's modular. So they'd be taking on a training for a couple of hours or half a day or whatever, and half an hour of that would be mindfulness snuck in amongst kind of personal well-being, digital well-being, emotional intelligence, a bit of this and that. And whereas now, most of the things I teach about, even though the topic isn't often directly mindfulness, it's a mindful approach to the topic. And I use mindfulness as the kind of foundational practice from which we resource ourselves from our own experience to have something to kind of work with in the session. So it's become just kind of central as the practice.
Sure. I mean, so are there any silver linings to the pandemic? I think there are. And one of them, I believe, is a greater awareness and acceptance and understanding and normalization around not just the terminology, but the reality of mental health and the importance of mindfulness and health and working environments, human connection, which there's no downside to any of that in terms of it being more acceptable and there being greater awareness around it. I still find if I talk about mindfulness, maybe to those who haven't, certainly to those who haven't trained with us yet, haven't sort of been through any of the sort of ecosystem components, I sometimes find the word mindfulness still seems a bit woo-woo, a bit tree hugger hippie stuff, a bit, yeah, that's not for me kind of approach. Do you still find that? Do you find mindfulness is still somehow, as a term, not widely understood, perhaps? Maybe that's the issue.
I don't encounter that very much, actually. And I'm not sure if it's because, a lot of places that I'm speaking or engaging, it's something that they've been dealing with fairly seriously for, certainly, 4 or 5 years now. It's always an interesting one to work with any organization or individual to find the language and the access point for them to, usually there's some outcomes that they'd like to improve. And if mindfulness is one of the ways in which you can, you're pretty sure you can help them, then it's really just a case of, how do I build a bridge from what I know and a practice that I know could be really resourcing for you to where you're coming from. I think as more and more people, find people in their friend circle, in their colleague circle, in their, people higher up in the business who are talking about it, who are doing it, it becomes more and more, well, why wouldn't you? For me, it's become, similar to talking about going to the gym. People talk about meditation at the same sort of level as that. And I think as a practice, it will become that as well. Like, everybody knows what the gym is. Everybody knows that going to the gym is generally good for most people. Some people do it and some people don't do it. And that's kind of that. And I think mindfulness is one of those things as well. Gradually people will kind of realize that there's something there, and they'll go on their own journey for whether it's for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, how do you describe mindfulness? How, to someone who perhaps wasn't entirely clear about what mindfulness, because we hear mindfulness, wellness, we hear, all these sort of terms, they often get kind of thrown together. And how would you describe mindfulness?
So I think the simplest way for people to understand it, and the reality of what it is in our current society now, is mindfulness is the secular rebrand of meditation. So you sometimes get into very strange discussions with people kind of almost arguing about the differences between mindfulness and meditation and so on. And it's like, well, it's a practice of silence, right? We're teaching people to do it as a formal seated practice, and then to apply that in an informal way into their lived experience. The idea of this is that it allows us to explore our inner world of consciousness, which is made up of thoughts, emotions, and sensations. And it turns out that this is useful for most people, because for most of us in our education and socialization, we haven't really been pointed towards our inner world of thoughts, emotions, and sensations, and asked to kind of build our own map to navigate it better. And it turns out that when we do start mapping our inner world of thoughts, emotions, and sensations, that we start realizing, oh, here are all the ways in which I get lost in fear and worry. Here are all the ways in which I get annihilated by my emotions. Here are all the ways in which I'm able to communicate my inner experience. And here are all the ways I can't. And we start realizing there's a massive kind of practice here of exploring what our inner experience is, so that we can both know ourselves more fully, but also then engage better with the people around us. And it also turns out that in doing this for ourselves, we develop the skills of compassion and listening, and an appreciation for the inner world of other human beings in a way that might not have been obvious to us if we hadn't done the work on ourselves. So, as a route into meditation, for me, if anyone is interested in any type of performance or excellence, then they have to be looking both outward into the external expression of that skill or what activity into the world, but they also have to have an equal and opposite look in, to see, well, what are the functions and programs that you're running that are helping and hindering you as you attempt that activity. So yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's I think anyone would be clear after listening to that. So thank you. Given that you're typically dealing in the C-suite, in this case, 20 plus years in a corporate environment myself, in different parts of the world. And in fact, the last 10 of those, so half of those, or close enough to half of those, was working for a German company, who were really a serious employer. They were a good company. They were serious about being turning out good product, and they were serious about being a good employer. But when it comes down to it, ultimately, they had shareholders. There was a board. There were expectations about the bottom line at the end of the day. And in fairness to them, they were very focused on attracting and retaining talent. So those were the driving commercial realities of what was a very responsible business in many ways, and they continue to be, I would imagine. How can mindfulness, how can being a conscious professional, how does that speak to those? How does that work? Because at the end of the day, if you're asking companies to make an investment in these services, how do they measure the success of them? How do you approach that? I'm genuinely intrigued.
Yeah, so I suppose to kind of go wide on that to start with, what we're going through at the moment as a global society is a massive shift in consciousness at a time where there's a lot at stake. We've got highly embedded capitalistic systems around the world, which have been overly weighted to profit at the expense of planet and people. We have a growing willingness to address this, particularly through COVID. We've had a bit of a sort of slap from Mother Nature and a sort of go to your room moment for us all to sit down and think about what we've been doing. And seeing if we can come back with a better attitude. As a result of that, in this sort of renewed intention or sort of groundswell of intention globally to address our fundamental existential problems of climate and environment and all the rest of it, we have to also, and this is one of the rules of mindfulness, you have to begin where you are. So we have to begin where we are, which is in each company, looking at how we function, looking at the degree to which we're playing into the old system, which is about profit at all costs, and look at ways in which we can gradually or quickly, if it's possible, move towards a more conscious engagement at all levels of the business. So over the years, we've sort of seen the markers in the sort of the rise of the conscious revolution. We've had books out on conscious business, conscious capitalism. I think in about 2014 came out, which I think still is the best kind of blueprint of how to really think through all the nuts and bolts of the company, from its purpose and vision, mission, but also its higher purpose. It's really important to get the higher purpose of the business right, so it's inspired, so it's engaging, so it's attuned to some sort of infinite game in the sort of cynic type of model. And to think about the leadership strategies, the culture, and the stakeholder integration. So the values of the business are really clear and are expressed at all levels through the business. So there's a lot of thinking to do in order just to kind of even overview. That is a piece of work which most businesses require someone to help them with. And then from there, it's like, well, what does this look like in our hiring strategy? What does this look like in our retention strategy? What does this look like in our comms? What does this look like in our leadership strategy and our structure, in how we, say what the roles actually are? All these types of things start to become little itty bitty jobs where we can now start harmonizing towards the higher purpose of the business. And of course, there has to be along the way still an eye on profit. We're not jettisoning capitalism. We're just bringing more awareness into it. That's why it's called conscious capitalism. And mindfulness is a tool of awareness, which is why I think it's foundational to all of this. If we don't have a capacity or an intention to be a bit more aware than we were when we started dealing with this 20 years ago, 100 years ago, or however long back, then we're just going to make the same mistakes again. So building awareness is key, in my view.
Sure. And how far down the path are we? And I guess my real question is, are there any really good examples of companies who have adopted a more conscious capitalism approach to the way they operate, and the results then demonstrate how worthwhile that is? Do we have some first movers out there who operate as great case studies?
So I'm always hesitant to give particular companies as case studies because they change their fortune and so on. Whole Foods was basically the book Conscious Capitalism came out of John Mackey's CEO-ship of Whole Foods and how he kind of managed it and how it grew and the growing pains and all of that, and his attempt to kind of demonstrate conscious leadership and implement it. It's a really amazing case study. It's obviously now been bought by Amazon, so it becomes swallowed by a different entity. And so it becomes a more complicated picture to point to Amazon and say that this is the most conscious business out there. I'm certainly not suggesting that. But there are companies out there. Patagonia is often given as a great example. Female CEO, and a really kind of beautiful integrated strategy that rolls out through the sustainability of the product into the way that the business is run, sort of nuts and bolts and all the way through. And in some of the books that you read on this topic, there are tables put together which show that conscious businesses outperform their rivals, and it does make sense because if we're really focusing on everybody pulling in the same direction, everybody being aligned behind a higher purpose, everybody's needs being seen as important rather than people, for example, being seen as cogs in a machine or as deserving of giving their pound of flesh for, whatever treatment, then you get a different level of trust, you get a different level of loyalty. But it's very much, this is the first decade that conscious leadership really is, or the second decade that conscious leadership has been a term that people are using. So what you're looking at the moment is really a tinkering in the conscious leadership, conscious capitalism space. But I do believe that it's very much the future. It's kind of an essential aspect of the human survival strategy for this century, is really to bring in enough awareness so that our capitalist companies and governmental structures don't eat each other, which is sort of the outcome of everything getting bigger and bigger and bigger and winning, and more winners, more losers. Is that we eat each other, we eat the planet. It's kind of like resources get munched. There needs to be a lot more innovation and creativity, which I think COVID was pretty good for, in order to take us in a new direction. So it's knife edge stuff.
Sure enough. And your book, Conscious Leadership, aims to help individuals to understand what's required. I know it's 20 proactive lessons. Tell us a little bit more about that book. I mean, how does that book serve the greater purpose that we're talking about?
Yeah, so I wanted to make a really sort of practical introduction to conscious leadership, which was very directed towards activities and practices and practical small things to implement. Sometimes when we hear about conscious leadership, it sounds like this sort of heady idea that is attempting to save the world. And we think, God, that's a bit much to sort of deal with on a Tuesday morning. I've got 10 minutes. So I wanted to make a book that, is something that you could dive into, that you could sort of see the scope of it. So it's laid out into these kind of 5 different sections, from self-knowledge to self-maintenance, self-management, self-development, and self-realization. And each has got these 4 topics, and you can sort of just look at one by one, maybe find a practice to try that day. You can read a chapter on, on the way on a bus or whatever. It's kind of an easy read. Just so that you get a sense of conscious leadership is actually something that I can aspire to, that I can bring into my own day-to-day, work. I can bring aspects of it home, and that it's not such a sort of lofty thing. Here's some really simple, practical aspects where essentially we're all going on this kind of journey of, the book was almost called self-mastery. Right. And really, that's what leadership really is about. Really, most leadership training is about self-development, looking at our, our constrictions, our triggers, working through them, overcoming our barriers, and stepping into potential. And that is what this book is for: building awareness and giving tools.
Sure. So it's definitely, the style of book is you can pick it up, open it anywhere, read that chapter or that lesson and put it down again, and pick it up and do the same again. It's intended that way, to be accessible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And it talks about the tools to increase your emotional intelligence, to build stress resilience and lead yourself and others with greater compassion, clarity, and joy. I'm interested about the emotional, well, all of it, but the emotional intelligence piece. How do you weave that into the training that you offer, and how do you bring that to the table for your clients?
Yeah, so in all of the trainings that we're doing, whether we're sort of naming emotional intelligence or not, we are supporting and cultivating emotional intelligence in participants, because we talked about mindfulness as being this kind of mapping of our thoughts, emotions, and sensations. So emotions are in there, and the human being is an emotional animal. As much as some people will tell you they're not, or that they don't express their emotions or whatever. The human being is an emotional creature. There's just no getting away from it. That's a sort of factual matter. And yet in the workplace, we've got all these messages around how our emotional life is sort of completely unwelcome. And as a result of that, most people find themselves operating or attempting to operate in a sort of emotionally free or clinical way. In order to develop emotional intelligence, the first part of it is to develop emotional self-awareness. And if we've got a lot of messages which are saying that we can't be in contact with our emotions because it's not safe or appropriate for our environment, which a lot of guys actually get that message very early on, boys can't cry, all of that kind of stuff that's being broken down at the moment and kind of reworked and looked at again, is really doing men a disservice, and women, to cut people off from their emotional reality, leaves them with this kind of sense of the emotions being some kind of threat that needs to be managed in a sort of military sense of putting up boundaries and barriers and barricades. So yeah, there's a lot of socialization and sort of thought structures to unpick when we start looking at emotional intelligence, because we have to enter an emotional intelligence conversation by becoming more emotionally articulate individually. So one of the apps that we recommend to people is one by, I think it's called Mark Brackett. It's called Mood Meter, and it just gives you these prompts to check in occasionally and to just figure out what you're feeling. A lot of people, if you ask them what they're feeling, will say they're good or they're fine, or sort of a neutral state. But it helps you to become more articulate around expressing what the actual emotions are that you're feeling, and whether they're high energy or low energy, and kind of what it's characterized by. And that's the first step.
Yeah, thank you. We'll put a link to that in the show notes for sure. I'll be checking it out myself. So that's EI. Building stress resilience. I mean, the last couple of years and counting, the language around resilience, the acceptance of the need, the benefit of helping people become more resilient, it is clearly something that, again.
For that, you have to turn off airplane mode.
Look at that. Hey, go Google. My phone is in airplane mode and still it does that. How good, huh? Thanks, Google.
Well, you need to, for stress resilience, you definitely need to turn off that mode.
I mean, I wonder what it was that it listened to, which word it was that it heard. Anyway, but that, that's for me, as we've talked about, silver lining, the fact there's much greater awareness around it. Again, when it comes to stress resilience, I'm interested to hear how you weave that into your training, when you're working with your clients or groups of clients. I mean, clearly meditation.
For stress resilience, we talk about mindset anchors and practices. So, just to give an example, one of my mindset anchors is the quote by Rumi, "Live life as if everything is rigged in your favor." And it's just something that, I come back to, and it holds a bit of a sort of vibrational anchor for me, particularly when, something challenging might be going on. And then we really encourage people to find practices that work for them and resonate for them in order to reset. So, as a human being, it's very difficult for us to imagine that we're going to go through a full day or week without in some way being triggered into some sort of fear or anxiety, however intense that might modulate, depending on what's going on in our lives at the time. So, instead of trying to dodge anything that might take us away from calm and stability, it's about finding practices that work for you regularly to get you back into a productive mindset and a calm vibration. When we go into we do a training on mindfulness, stress and performance, we go into the brain science of kind of what happens when the amygdala is triggered and what's happening to the brain and which parts of the brain go offline, and we go through all of that. The outcome of it, though, to sort of shortcut it, is that if when we're panicking we can remain connected to the breath and the body, then we can remain connected to our rational thinking, and be much more productive in the way that we manage it. So often, we sort of have the stimulus, which might send us into panic. If we can insert the practice there, even if it's a 20-second practice, we can have a very different experience of the next 5 minutes than if we just flow from the panic into dealing with whatever has happened. And then over the time, when people sort of find the thing that works for them, and it starts showing up, they'll start reporting that they're having a very different experience of their day, of their week, of their life. Because stress resilience is something that's not taught very often on the way to becoming, whatever you do professionally. It's often not trained very thoroughly. And so, helping people individually or in group to come to practices that work is our method.
Sure, thanks. And do you use meditation, therefore, to install those triggers to change? So stimulus occurs, to then, rather than following the normal behavior, to become more aware.
We try and introduce a range of different practices. For example, one of the ones that we teach is called FHB. So something triggers you in your world, you notice that you've been triggered, and you feel your feet on the floor, you place your hands on your heart, and the body's on breathing. So feet on floor, hand on heart, body on breathing. And it just allows you to stabilize at 3 points of contact into the physical body. And so, you practice that for even 20 seconds. Most people, once they've done it for 20 seconds, because it feels good, they want to do it a bit more. So they do it a little bit more.
Yep.
And then it's as if you're saying, I don't have to depart myself. And when we don't depart the body and the heart and the mind, we can engage with all of our resources online. And it's very different from how we're taught to engage, which is generally mind only. A lot of people are taught to solve problems by thinking about their problems, worrying about their problems. But real problem solving, or wise problem solving, perhaps we might say, occurs when we remain connected to the body, the heart, and then bring the mind on. The route to accessing wisdom is through the body, through the heart, into the mind. It's not straight to mind. Right. And most people were never taught the route to wisdom. And it's a really powerful, simple practice.
Yeah, I'm interested that I think there's still less so, but still some stereotypes out there around what meditation is and how it looks and how it has to be performed. And maybe that, in the good old days, Hollywood played a part in that, and TV shows and so on. You have your other book is 100 Mindfulness Meditations. I'm fascinated how you came to write that, create that book, and write the book. To have 100 different mindfulness meditations.
So I was trying to write a book for about 4 years, and it was going to be called The Conscious Professional.
You had plenty of notepads by all accounts. So.
What's that? Oh yeah, yeah, it did. Yeah, still got lots of notepads as well. But I've been trying to write this book for like 4 years, and it was called The Conscious Professional. It was going to basically, go along with the business and, be the sort of, this is what the, business stands for and all the rest of it. And this is what a conscious professional is. And it just wasn't sticking. And, anyway, I was getting frustrated with it. And then one morning, I woke up with an idea, having been thumbing through a recipe book. So this recipe book was called Genius Recipes or something. Beautiful book. And I was like, ooh, wouldn't it be cool to have a recipe book of meditations? Because a lot of the meditations at the time were all the same. There was like a mountain one, there was a lake one, there was a body scan one. Like there was a set of meditations that were out there and different people led them, but that was kind of it. And I'd always sort of almost made up meditations on the fly when I taught and wove in what we were talking about. And I really liked the sort of creative experience of that. So I thought, wouldn't it be cool to have a recipe book of meditations and to create a sort of a way of dipping into very different practices to inspire people to kind of get into practice, a bit like a recipe book inspires people to cook different stuff. It's like, how about trying this? And I wrote the book in 6 months from start to, like, it was published within 6 months. And so that sort of was a lesson to me, in sort of a ripe idea is the one to go with, rather than one that seems like it should be right.
Yeah, sure. Well, congratulations on that. That's rapid fire.
Yeah,
which is fantastic. What would be great? I mean, we could take a deep dive into describing meditation and the benefits of it. But if you're open to it, we have the opportunity, I guess, we're both live now, and you could guide me and the listeners through a practice. If you're open to it.
Yeah, of course, I'd love to.
As if there's a talk about putting you on the spot. You just said you enjoyed the creativity of that. So, one of the main issues, one of the top three, let's say, challenges a lot of the clients we deal with that they talk about, and it's one of the big barriers to many other elements of improving their lives. It's just a lack of time. They're just so busy. They're busy at work, they're busy at home, they're just busy and don't have enough time. And often we find that they're sacrificing their health and well-being through the perception that they don't have time to take care of themselves. So if that's an appropriate subject, time, then we could, you the royal we, you could guide me and the listener through a practice around time.
Sounds good. Let's go straight into it.
Look at that, no time to prepare.
Okay, so I'm going to guide the practice with my eyes open, but just inviting those who are listening, if it's appropriate for your situation, if you do wish to close your eyes, then just do so now. And if not, just hold a gentle, soft gaze. And we're just going to ensure that the body is sitting comfortably, feet flat on the floor, and just allow a sense of aliveness just to energize the spine, whether that brings a little bit of tallness or just allows you to soften. Just be guided by your body, whatever feels good for today. And as we drop in, we're just going to bring our attention to the breath. So we start with the breath. The breath is the doorway of mindfulness. So noticing the breath out the nostrils. And we're breathing in through the nose and breathing out through the nose. Lips together, teeth slightly apart, and just relaxing the muscles at the back of the neck, allowing the chin to drop forward just 1 centimeter. Just noticing if there's any tension in the jaw and just breathing a little bit of relaxation to those muscles and an invitation to soften. And so we drop in on the breath, and as the breath drops in, awareness begins to gather also. Perhaps even imagining the warmth of awareness dissolving through the body like ink, dissolving through water. And here in practice, we might just get that sensation of landing. Landing in the body, on the breath. And as we land, we start to notice that our presence enriches this moment of time. We begin to notice things which had been dialed out of awareness. Perhaps noticing the texture of clothing on skin. Noticing the warmth of the body. Landing in the feet, noticing this point of contact between the physical body and the physical earth, even through socks and shoes and carpet and concrete and timber. We are connected, body and planet. And so we remind ourselves of everything that it has taken for us to appear in this way today. Remembering all of our footsteps throughout the whole of our life have been leading to this seat. To this now, and here we are with the ability to breathe presence into this moment. Mindfulness is a practice of embodiment, and it is one in which we remember ourselves. The word remember means we put ourselves back together. The breath leads us into the body, the legs, the feet, the torso, the arms, the neck, the head, the skull, the eyes, the ears, the nose, the scalp, the hair, the skin. We find ourselves breathing through the body, in and through the body, feeling the awareness, the vibration of life, this process of dynamic, spontaneous life in which we are a participant, a passenger, a witness, both object and subject. We can come alive in the remembering of body and being and place and time. And so we might notice that mindfulness and presence doesn't take time, but gifts us time. The purpose of mindfulness is so that we don't miss out on our lives, so that we're here, so that we're present, so that we notice ourselves in and through time, both ways that human beings experience time as the fleeting present moment, but also as the eternal now, the narrative, the story of our lives. And so as we breathe here, connected through time and space, just reflecting for right now, for today, what is the most important thing to remember? What is the most important thing to remember? And remember, the most important thing is to remember the most important thing. And how can you express that in one practical action as you set forth from practice today? And so we will gather ourselves back through the body on the breath, finding the waves of the breath following the next exhale up and out, alighting once again at the tip of the nose, the nostrils, the sensations of air, the warmth of the exhale, and in your very own time, allowing the eyes to reopen.
I have to say that felt very self-serving. I appreciated it very much, and I'm conscious that anyone listening, if they weren't in a position whilst listening to this, then I hope they really do make a note to go back and sit through that practice and participate in that practice. Out of interest, how long was that?
I think it was about 5 minutes.
It's fascinating, isn't it? How time, I mean, I meditate daily, albeit only 10 or 15 minutes. But I always kind of lose sense of track of time, which I appreciate, because I'm being present, I'm being in the moment and focusing, which is part of the point, right?
Yeah.
But for anyone, I mean, a lot of the stuff we do in Level Up, which is only a 5-week, it's a primer for peak performance of productivity, and we introduce breath work, we introduce all sorts of things, but they're only 5 minutes. And even though we guide people to say, well, if you've got 20 minutes, then that would be amazing. But if you haven't, then just give it a go for 5 minutes. And it's so powerful, even just 5 minutes. And for anyone who thinks they don't have 5 minutes or 10 minutes in their day to practice some form of mindfulness, in this case meditation, then I think they're missing the trick, because it feels amazing.
Yeah, I think when people say they don't have time for mindfulness, what they're really saying is they don't consider it important enough to give 5 minutes of time to, which is fine.
Yeah.
But I think, I sometimes call BS on people's time issues around that. Say you only need the same level of professionalism with mindfulness as you do with brushing your teeth. And pretty much all adults brush their teeth twice a day, and it's not something, you don't get people at the office going, oh, I haven't got time to brush my teeth, sorry, my breath stinks, or whatever. People don't say that. It's like, no, it just happens because you consider it an important thing to do. And I think at some point it clicks with people. It's like, oh, this little mental hygiene thing that I do, which takes 5 minutes or whatever, is actually really important. But they have to kind of see and feel the benefit of it in their lives, to notice that kind of consciousness modulation, that anchoring that can take place in a short time to realize that it's worthwhile.
And as you said, when something feels good, we're motivated to do more of it. I know that you've created, I'm interested at what stage you felt the need to create your online meditation program. So learn how to meditate in 10 days, Zen in 10. At what stage in your journey did you realize that people just needed a way of learning how to do this?
So I think I've always known that, like, from the beginning of kind of the business, I knew that, people needed to be welcomed into the practice in a way that, felt real and relevant to them. I think because, from a very slow start of nobody being interested in my business to it getting busier over the years up until 2020 when COVID hit. By then I had become so busy that I wasn't really going to have time to create an online course, because I was doing so many speaking engagements and so on. But COVID gave me the opportunity to stop. I had more space and time. Everybody was at home and was looking for online learning to replace some of the in-person things that we'd lost through lockdown and so on. And so it sort of provided the right moment. And I suppose that the other impetus for it was, there is a place for all of these mindfulness courses and apps and things where you're carried through the practice by music or guidance,
yep.
Or some sort of talk or whatever. But I've always really wanted to leave people with the ability to meditate without any of the crutches, so that they actually could feel for themselves that they are the person doing the meditation or being the meditation, rather than having it done to them by a teacher or a guide or music or whatever. Because that is sort of the pro-challenge of mindfulness. Can we create the state in our own silence from stress and worry? Can we navigate into center? Can we come back into our own inner hum of quiet? And that's what I wanted to teach people in the schools. That's what's different about it, really.
Yeah, and absolutely. It was interesting when we had our sort of pre-chat. And since then, of course, I've gone through Zen in 10, and for years I've used Headspace as a form of guided meditation, and in fact I had never experienced anything else, and so I'm now weaning myself off guided meditation as a result of going through Zen in 10, and I really appreciate it. I hadn't really thought about it, but there had been occasions where I didn't have a very good signal for my phone. Yeah. So actually I missed doing it. I skipped it because, I didn't really, or I was traveling, and back in the good old days, didn't want to, the roaming charges were brutal, and Wi-Fi wasn't so prominent, as in public Wi-Fi and so on. And so, it was really interesting. There was nothing about it, even though I think there are huge benefits to it, and I'm a supporter of it. I have to say, I had never thought about the fact that I was beholden to it. I hadn't actually learned. I hadn't learned how to do it independently, and I appreciate very much that Zen in 10 focuses on that and empowers you to develop your own ability to meditate where, when, and how you like, ultimately.
Good. That's really lovely feedback. Thank you. That was the aim of it. So it's good to see that it's helping with that specific aim.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we'll link to that in the show notes. And having been through it, I can personally say it's fabulous. And it doesn't take a lot of time. So if you're time poor, know that it's going to be a great ROI here. For sure. Neil, I'm conscious of time. Frankly, I think I could talk to you all day, but I am conscious of time. I appreciate that you've guided me and the audience through that practice. Is there anything else you'd like to, it's always nice, and I know you feel the same way, to leave the listener with something. So even if it's just a final thought or a piece of advice, anything really, is there anything you'd like to share with the audience that we haven't touched on? Or maybe you'd like to emphasize something we have?
So I'll just share something that I'm working on in my own practice personally, which is one of the things I do at the moment is I try and track all the ways in which I contract during in the day, and sort of take it as my challenge to see if I can catch them and find a way of releasing them in the moment. I'm not very good at it. But it's a really interesting challenge to notice all the little, we have big triggers, which are really obvious, but all the little triggers, things that happen, things that irritate me, things that people say, people walking out in front of me, all sorts of little things that happen around me, and see if I can notice those and sort of work through them. What is it? What has taken me into irritation or frustration? Can I name that? Can I be with it? Can I release it? And another question I really like to ask myself, which is helping me with this contractions thing, is, do I do that? So often the things that really irritate me, when I ask myself the question, do I do that?
Right.
I also do it. I'm also guilty of doing it to
Great
other
question.
people. Yeah. So yeah, this isn't a sort of fully worked piece of advice or anything. It's more a practice I'm tinkering with, in case it resonates with anyone else to have a go at.
And how do you do that? I mean, do you make notes, or is it just mental notes?
It's mostly mental notes. I will, I think, at some point download it all a bit more thoroughly, because I think it would be useful. To kind of see all the different triggers and their different sort of levels of intensity. It's probably an exercise that's sort of creating in its for a training course or something down the line when I've got it figured out. But I think it's a really interesting practice to see, what are all the things that take me off center, and sometimes a lot of little things take you quite far away from center, and how do I get myself back? So.
That must be leading to an even greater sense of self-awareness. You're actively looking for those. You're ready.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I'm sort of obsessed with personal development and building awareness, and so yeah, I have a big appetite for kind of figuring these little bits out.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I appreciate it's a fantastic final share, I have to say. Well, thank you to everyone for listening. And if you've enjoyed this, please go ahead and share it, of course, and leave us a review on whichever platform you're using. It really does help more than you know. The algorithms get hold of that and help to share the love. And if you're interested in grabbing a copy of my book, Lead by Example, which talks about how to unleash your potential at work and life, I would love to send you a copy of it. If you could just go to theimpactproject.io, take a deep dive down that rabbit hole, and it'll be in your doorstep in no time. Obviously, my thanks to Neil. We'll be posting all of the various links to his socials, his website for sure, the books, the two books that Neil's written, and then the program and the app that was mentioned earlier in this conversation. It'll all be there in the show notes. So Neil, thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure having you here.
Thanks, Matt. It's been wonderful. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And until next time, for everyone listening, it's time to be brave, have fun, and make yourself busy making an impact on the world.